All right, so we have finished off nonlinear mechanical models. And what we're going to do today and next time is a little different. It's not really mechanics, it's more anatomy and function. But this is a biomechanics class, so I want to give you a little bit of the bio side of it. So today we're going to talk about tendons. And you'll notice you do not have a class assignment today or a problem assignment for today. Instead, you have just a little sort of quiz you're going to fill out based on stuff I say. So I suggest that what you do, depending on how you like to do things, you could do it afterwards, or you could just sort of follow along and fill in blanks and answer the questions as we go along. That's just fine. But we're going to talk about general principles and properties of tendons, and we're going to talk about two tendons that I think are particularly interesting. The Achilles tendon, also known as the calcaneal tendon, and the flexor digitorum profundum tendon, which is the one you use to bend your fingers. All right, so tendons are the junction between muscle and bone. They allow your muscles to transmit forces to your bone, thus affecting motion and opposing external loads. If I bend my arm, my bicep contracts. That doesn't do anything unless it moves the bone, right? So the biceps here is attached down here to the bone, and it pulls on the bone and allows my arm to move, right? And in case you're wondering, I can make it move especially slowly by using my triceps to resist it. We'll talk more about that later on if we get excited. Maybe I'll do a demo in class if I want to. It's kind of fun. There are a lot of tendons. I don't know how many. And there are a lot in part because muscles sometimes attach in multiple places. So this is your biceps. Again, it attaches down here in the radius, and it also attaches twice up in the shoulder. So there are three tendons just for the biceps, right? And of course you have another biceps on the other side, and then you have a bunch of other muscles. All of them have tendons. The tendon that attaches to the long head of the biceps runs along the humerus and then sort of tucks into the humeral capsule. So it actually sneaks in here and hides in here and eventually connects to the scapula, which is the shoulder blade. So when I bend here, I'm actually pulling against my shoulder blades as well as my clavicle. So I don't like pictures that are part of a sales pitch, but this picture turns out to be a really nice one. So this is from Peak Orthopedics. It's an orthopedics company, treatment center somewhere, I forget where. But it really shows how the tendons sort of go around. It shows how it has to curve around the humeral head, right? And also the tendons in the fingers are quite flexible, right? And we'll talk more about them in a sec. So if we're thinking about tendons, they have to be able to withstand very large tensile loads, right? They're the guys that take all the force your muscle can generate and send that force to a bone, all right? They also have to be able to get around corners, right? And they have to allow the body to move, right? This is not a trivial thing. Your bones are very good at withstanding forces, but they don't bend. So the tendon has to move and be strong, right? And we're going to remember something here from your undergraduate mechanics class. The tensile stress is the force per unit area, which goes as width times thickness, or as radius squared. So what that means is the amount of force something can handle gets bigger roughly with the square of its radius or with its width times its thickness, right? But bending stresses come from the moment divided by the area moment of inertia, which goes as the width times the thickness cubed, or the radius to the fourth, all right? So the dependence on thickness or on radius is much bigger in bending stiffness than it is in tensile stiffness or in tensile strength. So if you want your tendon to be able to handle very large tensions, but still be flexible, what you want to do is make it very, very stiff, but also very thin. You make it very thin because as you thin it, right, if I make it half as thick, I get a cubic change in the bending stiffness, but I only get a linear change in the tensile strength, in the tensile stiffness. So as I make it stiffer and thinner, I make it more flexible but still able to handle large tensions. And ribbons in particular work really well for this. And I drew a picture here. Though the two red boxes have the exact same area. So if these are cross sections of the same material being pulled into the page, they would both have the same tensile stiffness. But the square, where am I? Here it is. The square is 9 times stiffer in bending because it's 3 times as thick, and you get a factor of an h cubed here versus here. So it ends up being, you get an h cubed here and an h here, so it ends up being 9 times stiffer in bending. So if you make this thing very wide and thin, you get something that's still stiff but easy to bend. And that's why tendons look like that, right? It makes them able to transmit forces along their length very effectively, but still bend around turns. And this is just a side notion. In general, the muscles do not have much moment arm in bending the bone, right? There are some very strong functional reasons for this. The biggest one is muscles are very good at generating force, but not very good at generating displacement. So by having a small moment arm, you can generate large motions with the much less motion of the muscle itself. This is the same reason why I read if you're swinging a bat, if you put your hands close together at the end of the bat, if you're strong enough to swing it, you can make the bat head move really fast and really far. Whereas if I put my hands far apart, I don't have to be as strong to swing it, but I can't get as much motion on the bat unless I move my hands a lot also. Right? So the result of that is that the muscles have very short moment arms. And as an example, this is the olecranon process, which moves when I bend my elbow. So it comes off here off the elbow, and then these are attached to the tendons coming up here that would open up the bone. And the tendons can't be too slack, right? If the tendon was too slack, the joint wouldn't move because the muscle doesn't move very far. So if the tendon had too much slack in it, it would just not do anything. And it has to be able to be very stiff so we can hold things in place, right? We have a very small moment arm. We're going to put a lot of force on it, right? To generate a reasonable moment with that small moment arm, which means if I want to hold my Coke, right, and really what I'm doing is holding my arm because my arm is heavier than my Coke, the tendon in my elbow has to be strong enough. It can't creep. It just has to hold there so that it can support that load, right? Otherwise, we would have a problem. So this is what a typical tendon stress strain curve looks like. This is for Achilles tendon. We'll come back to it. It has a toe region, and then it starts to curve up, right? And I'll just mention, the toe region is a little tricky because in you, there's always some tension. The tissue is never actually down here, right? Unless it's really slack. In normal conditions, you start with some preload and then it goes up. Okay? So that's that. So that's how tendons work, right? And then they get stiff, and these actually would turn up, and we'll talk about it in a sec. They will lock out. Now I'm going to talk about 2 specific tendons, and you're dealing with me, so you're going to get a little bit of a diversion. We're going to talk about Achilles. So Achilles was the greatest of the Greek warriors at Troy. All right? He was a rotten person. He was not noble. He was lousy company. He was not a nice guy. He tried to get out of the war twice, but in the end, he did it. And he was undoubtedly the guy you would want on your side when you were choosing up sides for a war. He was a terrible person, but he was a great warrior. And you know just how great a warrior he was because they had Brad Pitt play him in the movie, right? And so you know he's the biggest stud in the movie because they wanted Brad Pitt to play him. Sadly, it did not end well for our hero Achilles. As many of you probably know, he was completely invulnerable except for his heel. This is a painting by Peter Paul Rubens showing the death of Achilles. And there's an arrow here, which you probably can't see, but I can blow it up a little, and you can see that arrow went right through his heel. And it did him in. That was too bad, tough break Achilles. But his reward for this was that they named a tendon in the heel after him. And it's called that because of where it is, but I think it's also appropriate because it's a big, strong tendon. It's the biggest tendon you have. This is a sketch of Achilles, the Achilles tendon from Gray's Anatomy. It's also called the calcaneal tendon because it inserts into the heel bone, which is the calcaneus. It's this long sheet here. And it actually is attached to 2 different muscles, the soleus, which is this guy here, and the gastrocnemius, which is cut away in this view, but would be attaching here. And the two muscles, the tendon comes together and fuses, and it inserts into the calcaneus, and it is attached to the heel. And its job is to generate what's called a plantar flexion. It bends the foot down, which has the equivalent of moving the body up if the toes don't move. So it comes down here. This is the Achilles tendon in the foot. And you can imagine if I wanted to pop up on my toes, I would contract my calf muscles. I lost my, there we go. I would contract my calf muscles, which would cause an upward force here, which causes a moment around this and causes the foot bones to pivot around the leg bone and push the toes down. But since my toes are against the floor, the result is that I pop up, right? Look at that. Achilles tendon at work, right? Those forces can be very, very large, right? We have multiple times body weight, even in normal gait, just when you're walking around. And so it's a big tendon, right? Here's a picture of an isolated Achilles tendon from the Doring paper I mentioned earlier. So that where we got the data from. You can see it's not just long and wide, it's thick, it's just a big tendon. Its cross-sectional area can be on the order of a square centimeter, which is very large for a tendon. And these are some data I showed before. Just to remind you, the loads in the tissue can be on the order of megapascals, 20 megapascals. It's a very high stress, right? If you look at the peak loads are thousands of newtons with a 1 centimeter cross section. We're talking about a 20 megapascal load, all right? And you might be very frightened now, because if you were paying very close attention earlier in the talk, we saw that the stress goes up only to 8 megapascals. But the stress could be 20. It's off the chart. It is true. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not being hyperbolic or figurative. The stress is off the chart. It is not on the chart. So this is a problem, right? And fortunately for us, you might say, oh my gosh, if it gets to 7% strain at 6 or 7 MPa, if I go to 20 MPa, this thing is going to get to like 20% strain. It's going to be stretching all over the place, and it's not going to transmit the force to the joint well enough, because it's just going to stretch the tendon, right? The muscle is going to contract, the tendon is going to stretch, the foot's not going to move, and you can't walk. And we're saved by lockout, right? And in fact, this plot doesn't show it as well as it could, but these curves are going to just start to shoot way up. Up, 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 up. They're going to lock out. And here's some other data, right? So Wren reports that the failure strain of the tissue is about 9%, right? So this is 7. Ha! Why is 6 afraid of 7? Because 7, 8, 9, right? 8, 9. If we just go this much farther out into the curve, the stress gets up to 79 MPa. That is just shooting up, right? These guys, well, a grip strain of about 20%, so that's probably somewhere in the range of a 10 to 15, maybe a 17% strain. As failure PK1 stress of 59 MPa. So the tendon doesn't fail under normal loads, and you should be happy about that because it means you're able to walk. And it in fact doesn't even stretch as much as you might think because of the lockout effect. So that's the Achilles tendon. And it is, to me, one limit of what tendons are. It is the biggest tendon you have. Its job is to withstand force, and it is in a part of you that has a lot of flexibility. Not like flexibility like I can bend, but like you don't have to do a lot other than straighten your foot, right? You don't do a lot with your foot other than walk on it or stand on it, right? So it's a single job. Now the contrast to that for me is the flexor digitorum profundus. So for the non-Latinists among you, flexor means bender, so it bends something. Digitorum means of the fingers, so it's the bender of the fingers. Profundus means it's located deep within the tissue. Profundus means deep, same root as profound. And tendon means it's a tendon because this all actually applies to the muscle, which then attaches to the tendon. Okay? It's my other favorite tendon. I'm going to call it the FDP tendon because flexor digitorum profundus, and it runs through the carpal tunnel and connects to the finger, which allows a muscle in the arm to flex your finger. And if you go like this, you'll notice if you put your hand on your wrist, you can feel that what's really happening is the muscles in your arm are moving these fingers, not muscles in your hand. So you can do that to amuse yourself in your spare time. Here's a really good sketch of it showing how they run up into the fingers, then they come down through the carpal tunnel and out into the hand. And here's a side view. This is where the tendon is magically pulled away from the bone. So this is the tendon here, this yellow guy. It actually runs right along the bone. But in this picture, they've pulled it away. And it really lets you see how the tendon comes through and is sort of hooked by the various pulleys that attach it to the bone. So it's essentially a long strip that runs along the bone and is attached to the bone at certain points with pulleys. So when the muscle contracts, the whole finger curls, right? It just pulls in on it like a pulley. And then if you want to straighten your fingers, you have extensors on the backside. Okay? Now, the FDP tendon has to do a lot of stuff, but the forces are small, right? These are some data. I think this is from Andy On's group, I forget, where they're looking at different forces, and this is in kilograms of force, for various activities, right? And the FDP is this black guy here. So the ones that they talk about are a so-called a tip pinch or a lateral pinch. So if you go like this, like you would when you try to pick up something on the ground, or if you pinch your finger against the side of your finger against your thumb like you do when you're holding a key, these are forces that you see. And you notice these forces are on the order of tens of kilograms, which is equivalent to about 50 to 75 newtons. Right? This is nothing compared to the forces that the Achilles tendon has to carry, right? Which are 20 to 50 times that. But they do have to be very flexible and very small, right? Because if you had Achilles tendon in each finger, you wouldn't be able to bend your fingers, right? You certainly wouldn't be able to play your piano or type on your computer or write with a pencil or do anything else that requires the fine motor skills that are so characteristic of humans, right? That in order to have all of that fine control over your fingers, you have to have not too much stuff there, because that slows everything down, right? So they have to be very, very thin. So if you look at the stress-strain curves for the FDP, what you see, I believe this is Cauchy stress versus linear strain, right? That they don't have the big toe region. They're very tight, and this is somewhat linear. And if I plot the stress-strain curves on the same, I put them next to each other. This is the stress-strain curve for the FDP. This is the stress-strain curve for the Achilles tendon. The FDP is much, much stiffer, right? This is at 5% strain. It's hitting 80 megapascals, whereas the Achilles tendon at 7% strain is only hitting 8 megapascals, right? So the FDP is a much, much stiffer tendon, but it's also much, much thinner, right? And that's why it is able to perform its functions. It is designed to be very stiff and very thin. So it doesn't take up much space, it doesn't interfere with other motions, and it allows bending, and it can bend really far, right? Your Achilles tendon doesn't really have to bend very much. It sits in the back of your heel and goes up and down, but it doesn't really have to bend. The FDP has to be able to curl with your finger. So again, we want it to be very, very thin, very low cross-section, very flat, but very stiff so it can still transmit forces. Okay. We're going to do a couple quick asides now. This is the carpal tunnel. I just love this picture. So this is looking down your carpal tunnel or up your carpal tunnel, depending on which way you think of it. It's your palm is on the top of the picture, and your thumb and pinky would be on these respective sides. And all the tendons run through this channel in your wrist. This is the so-called carpal tunnel. And in case you're interested, if you do too much motion of your fingers and wrists, especially repetitive motions, they rub against each other, this area becomes inflamed, and you get carpal tunnel syndrome. So, just so you know. All right, we have our second classical aside. This is a big day for classical asides. This is Milo of Croton, sometimes called Milon, because in Greek, depending on which form of the words you use, you could get it with or without the O, without the N. He was the greatest wrestler in ancient Greece. He was a 6-time Olympic champion. Now remember, the Olympics are only held every 4 years. So that means for 20 years, he was the best wrestler. Right? And he was said to be, he was so strong, he could hold a piece of fruit in his hand and no one could take it, but he didn't crush it. He had these incredibly strong hands. And they said he could bend his finger and no one could unbend it. So you know that his flexores digitorum were really, something special, right? That when you think about the finger strength, Milo of Croton is just the top of the heap. Sadly, like Achilles, it did not go so well in the end. The story is he tried to test his strength by ripping a tree trunk apart. So there was a tree trunk with a cleft in it, either from a lightning strike or from the way it grew. It's not exactly clear. And he bet he could put his hands in it and rip it apart. And his hands got stuck. And depending on which version of the story you read, sometimes it's a lion, sometimes it's a pack of wolves, but some wild beast happened by and everybody else ran away. And there was Milon with his hand stuck in the tree. And I found this nice painting that tells you how the story ends. Here's the lion, here's Milon, and that's the end of that. So the moral of the story is sometimes having good flexores digitorum is not enough, especially if you try to rip trees apart in a region populated by lions. So I would suggest avoiding that in your future. So what we want to do today, talk about tendons, how they work, talk about a couple of them, and think about their function, right? I want you to be able to work the sums, but I also want you to be able to think about what's happening, right? What is this tendon doing? Why is it the way it is? And so that's what we really want to get out of today. Also, just to give you a little more exposure to the bio side of biomechanics. So there's no assignment except to fill out the quiz, which is easy because it's all stuff I talked about. And have a good day, and I'll see you in class.